How does a nation, rich in diversity and beauty, allow itself to be torn apart by a system designed to dehumanize and oppress its own people? How do generations endure unspeakable injustice, yet find the courage to fight, to hope, and ultimately to triumph against overwhelming odds? This is the epic, heartbreaking, and ultimately inspiring story of apartheid in South Africa. A dark chapter that reminds us of humanity's capacity for cruelty, but also its incredible power to overcome. It was a system that cast a long, oppressive shadow over the rainbow nation, dividing families, denying dignity, and enforcing brutal segregation based solely on the color of a person's skin. Yet, within this darkness, sparks of resistance ignited, grew into a roaring flame, and ultimately brought down a regime that seemed invincible. To understand apartheid, we must look back, far before its official beginning, to the very seeds of division planted on South African soil. The story begins not with equality, but with conquest and control. In the mid-17th century, in 1652, Dutch settlers, known as Boers, meaning farmers, arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, establishing a refreshment station for ships sailing to the east. They encountered the indigenous Khoisan people, and later the powerful Xhosa and Zulu nations. As these European settlers expanded their farms and influence, conflicts inevitably arose. Over time, more Europeans arrived, including French Huguenots and German immigrants, all contributing to a growing white population who saw themselves as distinct and superior. They built their lives on land taken from African communities, relying on enslaved people brought from other parts of Africa and Asia, and later the forced labor of local populations. Centuries later, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the British Empire arrived, seizing control of the Cape Colony. This brought a new layer of complexity and conflict. While the British initially brought some reforms, their presence further entrenched racial hierarchies. The Boers, feeling their way of life threatened by British rule and their more liberal policies regarding race, embarked on the Great Trek in the 1830s. This was a mass migration of thousands of Boers into the interior of South Africa, where they established independent republics like the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. This movement led to further violent clashes with African groups like the Zulu, as the Boers sought to expand their territory and maintain their systems of racial domination. The late 19th century saw the discovery of vast mineral wealth, diamonds in Kimberley and gold in the Witwatersrand, near present-day Johannesburg. This sparked a gold rush, drawing in more European immigrants and leading to rapid industrialization. But it also intensified racial tensions and exploitation. African laborers were vital for the mines, but they were paid miserably low wages, forced to live in segregated compounds and subjected to harsh working conditions. The British and the Boers eventually fought two Anglo-Boer wars, 1880, 1881, and 1899, 1902, over control of these rich lands. The British ultimately won, consolidating their power. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed, bringing together the various British colonies and Boer republics under a single self-governing dominion within the British Empire. This was a moment of hope for some, but for the majority black African population, it was a disaster. The new constitution essentially granted political power exclusively to the white minority. Laws were quickly enacted to formalize racial segregation and economic oppression. The Natives' Land Act of 1913 was particularly devastating. It reserved over 87% of the land for white ownership, leaving the vast majority of the black population confined to just 13% of the country, often in fertile or overpopulated areas. Imagine being told you could not own land in your own ancestral home, being stripped of your most fundamental right to sustain yourself. This law forcibly dispossessed millions and created enduring poverty. Other laws, like the infamous pass laws, required black Africans to carry a passbook at all times, restricting their movement and controlling their lives. Failure to produce a passbook meant immediate arrest and severe penalties. For decades, these discriminatory laws slowly built the foundation for a deeply divided society. Yet, the final, most brutal chapter was yet to begin. After World War II, a group called the National Party, which represented the interests of white Afrikaners, descendants of the original Dutch settlers, came to power in the 1948 general election. Their election platform was simple, stark, and terrifying: apartheid. The word itself means apartness in Afrikaans. Their goal was to make racial segregation total and legally binding, to ensure white supremacy in every aspect of life forever. And so, the systematic, state-enforced dehumanization began. With the National Party in power, apartheid was swiftly constructed, piece by agonizing piece, through a battery of laws that infiltrated every corner of life. It was a legal framework designed to deny, to separate, and to control. First came the Population Registration Act of 1950. This was the very bedrock of apartheid. It required every person to be classified by race: white, black, African, colored, people of mixed race, and Indian, people of South Asian descent. Imagine the absurdity and the cruelty of officials deciding your entire life's trajectory based on arbitrary physical features, like the pencil test. If a pencil stuck in your hair, you might be classified as colored or black. This classification determined everything: where you could live, work, study, whom you could marry, and even whom you could be friends with. It was a label that sealed your fate. Hand in hand with racial classification was the infamous Group Areas Act of 1950. This law designated specific urban areas for each racial group. Its implementation led to one of the most painful aspects of apartheid: forced removals. Millions of black, colored, and Indian people were forcibly evicted from their homes, often vibrant multiracial communities, and dumped into impoverished, ethnically segregated townships on the outskirts of cities. District 6 in Cape Town, a lively colored community, was brutally bulldozed. Sophiatown in Johannesburg, a cultural hub for black artists and intellectuals, met a similar fate. Families watched helplessly as their homes, their churches, their schools, and their entire lives were destroyed, replaced by sterile white suburbs or barren land. Imagine the trauma of generations, seeing their history literally erased before their eyes. Life in the designated townships and bantustans, also known as homelands, was a daily struggle. These were supposed to be independent or self-governing territories for various African ethnic groups, but in reality they were impoverished, overcrowded, and underdeveloped reserves. They served as reservoirs of cheap labor for white industries, and their citizens were stripped of their South African nationality, becoming foreigners in their own country. In the townships, families lived in cramped, often shoddily built houses, sometimes without electricity, running water, or proper sanitation. Schools were inadequate, clinics were few, and opportunities were scarce. Public transport was often limited, forcing people to endure long, exhausting commutes to work in white areas. Every aspect of life was designed to remind black people of their inferiority. The pass laws became an even heavier burden. Every black African adult had to carry a reference book, passbook, at all times. This document dictated where they could live, where they could work, and for how long. Police checks were constant and arbitrary. If you were caught without your passbook, or in a white area without the correct stamp, you faced immediate arrest, fines, or even imprisonment. Millions of arrests were made under these laws, shattering families and filling prisons. Imagine living in constant fear, your freedom of movement dictated by a small booklet, your dignity constantly under assault. Education was weaponized through the Bantu Education Act of 1953. This law decreed that black children would receive an inferior education, deliberately designed to prepare them for manual labor and subservience, not for leadership or intellectual pursuits. Hendrik Verwoerd, a key architect of apartheid, famously stated that black people should not be educated beyond the needs of their station in life. Funding for black schools was a fraction of what white schools received. Imagine being a child, eager to learn, but being told that your aspirations were limited, that your mind was only meant for certain tasks. This systematic intellectual suppression was a cruel blow to generations of black South Africans. Even the most intimate aspects of life were controlled. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949 and the Immorality Act of 1950 made it illegal for people of different races to marry or have sexual relationships. These laws tore apart families, branded innocent couples as criminals, and were designed to prevent any blurring of racial lines. Imagine falling in love with someone, only for the state to declare your love illegal, a crime against society. Apartheid also seeped into social and cultural life. Parks, beaches, hospitals, post offices, buses, and even public benches were segregated. Whites-only signs were ubiquitous. Black people were denied access to most public amenities and cultural institutions. Sports teams were segregated, and South Africa was eventually banned from international competitions like the Olympics. Artists and writers faced censorship and repression. The government tried to erase black history and culture, replacing it with a narrative of white superiority. This was the suffocating reality of apartheid. It wasn't just a set of laws, it was a total system of control, designed to break the spirit, to instill fear, and to maintain the power and privilege of a minority at the expense of the majority. But even the most oppressive systems cannot fully extinguish the flame of human dignity and the yearning for freedom. Even as the iron fist of apartheid tightened its grip, the spirit of resistance never truly died. From the earliest days of segregation, brave individuals and groups began to challenge the injustice, laying the groundwork for a long and arduous struggle. One of the most significant organizations was the African National Congress, ANC, founded in 1912. Initially, the ANC adopted non-violent methods inspired by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, who had developed his philosophy of peaceful resistance in South Africa. In the 1940s, a younger, more radical generation of leaders, including Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, emerged within the ANC Youth League. They pushed for more direct action. This led to the Defiance Campaign of 1952, a pivotal moment. Thousands of black South Africans, alongside some colored and Indian allies, deliberately broke apartheid laws such as pass laws and segregation rules, accepting arrest and imprisonment. They filled the jails, hoping to overwhelm the system. Imagine the courage of ordinary people knowingly breaking unjust laws, facing down armed police simply to assert their humanity. Though the campaign did not immediately repeal the laws, it mobilized thousands, filled townships with a new sense of defiance, and brought international attention to apartheid. One of its key leaders was Albert Luthuli, a former school principal and chief, known for his wisdom and commitment to non-violence. His leadership earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1960, the first African to receive it, highlighting the moral authority of the anti-apartheid struggle to the world. other voices also rose. The Pan-Africanist Congress, PX, founded in 1959, broke away from the ANC. Led by figures like Robert Sobukwe, the PASI advocated for a more assertive Pan-African approach, emphasizing black self-reliance and less cooperation with other racial groups in the struggle. They believed that Africans should liberate themselves. Trade unions also played a crucial role, organizing workers, often illegally, to protest unfair wages and working conditions, which were inextricably linked to racial discrimination. Religious leaders, too, became moral voices of conscience, often risking their own safety to condemn apartheid from their pulpits and organize community support. These early fighters, with their diverse strategies and unwavering commitment, kept the flame of hope alive when it seemed all but lost. The 1960s and 70s marked a tragic escalation in the apartheid regime, its brutality, and the resistance movement, its forced shift towards more desperate measures. On March 21, 1960, a peaceful anti-pass law demonstration organized by the PAC in Sharpeville, a township near Johannesburg, turned into a massacre. Thousands of unarmed protesters gathered, many leaving their passbooks at home, ready to be arrested. The police opened fire on the crowd, killing 69 people and wounding over 180, many shot in the back as they tried to flee. Imagine the sheer terror, the indiscriminate violence against people who were simply asking for their dignity. This brutal event shocked the world, bringing widespread international condemnation and leading the United Nations to declare it an International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In the aftermath, the apartheid government banned both the ANC and the PASI, driving them underground and forcing them to reconsider their non-violent strategies. With peaceful protest now brutally suppressed, many leaders, including Nelson Mandela, concluded that violence was the only option left. The ANC formed its armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, abbreviated as MK, in 1961. The PAC formed its own armed wing, Pogo. These groups began a campaign of sabotage against government infrastructure, carefully avoiding civilian casualties where possible. The struggle was no longer just about words. It was about direct, albeit limited, confrontation. The government responded with even greater repression. In 1963, many top leaders of MK, including Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and Ahmed Kathrada, were arrested at a farm in Rivonia. This led to the infamous Rivonia trial, 1963-1964. The defendants faced charges of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government, charges that carried the death penalty. It was during this trial that Nelson Mandela delivered his powerful "I am prepared to die" speech from the dock, explaining the ideals of a free, democratic, and non-racial South Africa for which they were fighting. He declared, "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Imagine the impact of those words, spoken with such clarity and courage, knowing he faced execution. Mandela and his comrades were sentenced to life imprisonment, sending a chilling message to the resistance, but also turning them into global symbols of the anti-apartheid struggle. Mandela spent 27 long years in prison, much of it on Robben Island. With many senior leaders in prison or exile, a new movement emerged in the late 1960s and 1970s, the Black Consciousness Movement, BCM. Led by the brilliant and charismatic Steve Biko, the BCM focused on psychological liberation. Biko argued that black people first needed to free their minds from the internalized inferiority that apartheid had forced upon them. He famously declared, "Black is beautiful," a phrase that was not about hating white people, but about instilling pride and self-worth in black South Africans. He urged them to rely on their own strength and unity, believing that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Imagine the power of this message to young people, growing up in a system that constantly told them they were less. BCM inspired cultural pride, community self-help programs, and a new generation of activists. This rising defiance erupted dramatically on June 16, 1976, in the Soweto uprising. Thousands of black schoolchildren in the township of Soweto took to the streets in a peaceful protest against the Bantu Education Act, specifically against the government's decree that Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, be the primary language of instruction in schools. They were met with unimaginable state violence. Police fired live ammunition into the marching children. The iconic image of a dying Hector Peterson, a 13-year-old boy, being carried by a fellow student, his sister running beside them, became a global symbol of apartheid's brutality. Hundreds of children were killed and thousands injured in the following days and weeks as the protests spread. The Soweto uprising reignited international outrage and fueled a new wave of internal resistance. The government, however, remained unyielding. In 1977, Steve Biko was arrested under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, which allowed for indefinite detention without trial. He was subjected to brutal interrogation and torture by the security police in Port Elizabeth. On September 12, 1977, Steve Biko died in police custody at the age of 30 from massive head injuries. The government initially claimed he died from a hunger strike, but the truth eventually emerged, confirming he had been severely beaten. His death, like Hector Peterson's, became another powerful rallying cry against apartheid, turning Biko into a martyr and a global icon for justice. The 1960s and 1970s were dark, violent decades, but they forged unbreakable spirits and laid the foundation for the ultimate victory against apartheid. While the people of South Africa fought on the ground, a powerful force was slowly building beyond its borders: international pressure. The brutality of apartheid, exposed by brave journalists and fleeing activists, began to chip away at the regime's legitimacy on the world stage. The United Nations became a crucial forum for condemning apartheid. Year after year, resolutions were passed, denouncing the system as a crime against humanity. Sanctions were increasingly called for, though not always universally applied. The UN Security Council imposed an arms embargo against South Africa in 1977, a significant step. Imagine the international community, little by little, turning its back on a government because of its oppressive policies. Cultural and sporting boycotts became incredibly effective tools. South Africa was banned from the Olympic Games starting in 1964 and remained excluded for decades. International artists refused to perform in the country, and sporting teams refused to compete against South African teams. Imagine a nation, proud of its sports, being completely isolated from global competition, feeling the sting of rejection on every playing field. Musicians like Bob Marley and Stevie Wonder released songs condemning apartheid, and concerts like Artists United Against Apartheid raised global awareness. Economic sanctions and divestment campaigns gained momentum, especially in the 1980s. Activists around the world campaigned for universities, churches, and pension funds to sell off their investments in companies that did business with South Africa. This was known as divestment. Imagine ordinary citizens in America, Europe, and elsewhere demanding that their institutions cut financial ties with the apartheid regime, putting real economic pressure on the government. Companies like IBM, General Motors, and Coca-Cola eventually pulled out of South Africa, costing the regime billions and demonstrating its growing isolation. Anti-apartheid movements sprang up in dozens of countries, mobilizing millions of people. These movements organized protests, rallies, and educational campaigns, keeping the issue alive in the public consciousness. Figures like Oliver Tambo, who led the ANC in exile for many years, tirelessly traveled the world, lobbying governments and rallying support. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a tireless advocate for justice within South Africa, became a powerful moral voice, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984 for his non-violent struggle against apartheid. International figures like Sweden's Olof Palme, India's Indira Gandhi, and leaders of newly independent African nations constantly spoke out against the injustice. The global media, despite efforts by the apartheid regime to control information, played a crucial role in exposing the horrors within South Africa. Images and stories of forced removals, police brutality, and the suffering of ordinary people reached homes around the world, turning public opinion decisively against the regime. This international pressure, combining moral outrage with economic and cultural isolation, began to slowly but surely erode the foundations of apartheid. By the 1980s, the apartheid regime was facing an undeniable crisis. Internal resistance, fueled by decades of struggle, was intensifying, and international pressure was mounting, making the country an outcast in the global community. The system was becoming unsustainable. Inside South Africa, the townships became increasingly ungovernable. Young activists, known as the Comrades, organized protests, boycotts, and civil disobedience campaigns. Schools were often at the center of the struggle, becoming battlegrounds for freedom. Violence flared as police and military forces tried to suppress the unrest, but the spirit of defiance only grew stronger. Imagine living in a township where every day could bring a protest, a clash with police, or the mournful sound of another funeral for a fallen activist. Even within the white community, cracks began to appear. Some businesses realized that apartheid was economically unviable, harming trade and investment. A small but courageous group of white liberals and intellectuals also spoke out against the injustices, often facing their own forms of harassment and repression from the state. The government, led by P.W. Botha for much of the 1980s, tried some cosmetic reforms, but these were largely rejected by the majority, who demanded fundamental change. The regime was caught between growing internal rebellion and crippling international sanctions. It was a losing battle, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. Then, in 1989, a new president, F.W. de Klerk, came to power. De Klerk, a lifelong Afrikaner nationalist, was pragmatic. He understood that apartheid could no longer be maintained by force. He made the courageous and historic decision to begin dismantling the system, recognizing that negotiation, not continued conflict, was the only path forward for South Africa. On February 2, 1990, in a speech to Parliament that stunned the world, de Klerk announced the unbanning of the ANC, PAC, and other anti-apartheid organizations. He also declared his intention to release Nelson Mandela from prison. Imagine the shock, the hope, the sheer disbelief that swept through South Africa. It was a moment that felt like the world had been turned upside down. Just 9 days later, on February 11, 1990, the gates of Victor Verster prison opened, and Nelson Mandela, after 27 long years behind bars, walked out a free man. Millions watched on television as the dignified, smiling figure, now 71 years old, strode hand in hand with his wife Winnie into the embrace of his people. The joy was electrifying, a powerful symbol that freedom was finally within reach. His release marked the true beginning of the end for apartheid. What followed was a period of intense and often precarious negotiations between the ANC, led by Mandela, and the apartheid government, led by de Klerk. These negotiations were incredibly difficult, marked by moments of hope, despair, and outbreaks of violence. There were attempts by hardline elements on both sides, as well as third parties, to derail the process through political assassinations and clashes in the townships, causing immense suffering. Imagine sitting across a table, negotiating with people who had imprisoned you for decades, knowing that every word could either lead to peace or plunge the country back into civil war. Mandela and de Klerk, despite their vastly different backgrounds, found a way to work together, earning them both the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. The negotiations eventually led to a new democratic constitution and the agreement for the country's first ever democratic, non-racial elections. The air was thick with excitement, anticipation, and a deep sense of historical significance. On April 27, 1994, South Africa held its first truly democratic elections. Millions of people, many of whom had never been allowed to vote in their lives, stood in long lines, patiently waiting to cast their ballot. Imagine the emotion, the sheer joy, as elderly men and women who had lived their entire lives under oppression finally placed their X on a ballot paper, exercising a right they had fought and suffered for so long. It was a day of profound dignity, a true triumph of the human spirit. The images of people of all races voting together, celebrating together, filled the world with hope. The outcome was a landslide victory for the ANC, and Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. The nation, once fractured by racial hatred, was now trying to build itself as a rainbow nation, a place where all its diverse peoples could live together in peace and equality. One of the most remarkable initiatives of the new government was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, established in 1995. Led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the TRC was a unique process designed to help the country heal from the deep wounds of apartheid. Instead of simply punishing perpetrators, the TRC offered amnesty to individuals who confessed to politically motivated crimes committed during apartheid, provided they fully disclosed the truth of their actions. Victims were given a platform to tell their stories, to confront their tormentors, and to seek acknowledgement of their suffering. Imagine the courage it took for victims to recount their pain and for perpetrators to admit their crimes, all in the hope of building a better future. It was a painful, often agonizing process, but it was seen as a vital step towards national healing and confronting the brutal realities of the past. Building a new South Africa was, and still is, a monumental challenge. The legacy of apartheid runs deep. Economic inequality remains vast, with many black South Africans still living in poverty, while the white minority often retains significant wealth. Social integration is an ongoing process, and the wounds of the past are still felt by many generations. Yet, the nation embarked on this journey with an incredible spirit of forgiveness, reconciliation, and a shared commitment to building a just society. The story of apartheid in South Africa is a powerful reminder of how dangerous it is when prejudice is enshrined in law, when one group systematically denies the humanity of another. It shows us the devastating consequences of hate, division, and the relentless pursuit of power through oppression. But more importantly, it is a story of extraordinary resilience, unwavering courage, and the ultimate triumph of justice. It is a testament to the power of ordinary people who, when united by a common cause, can bring down even the most entrenched systems of injustice. It teaches us the importance of fighting for dignity, for equality, and for the right of every human being to live a life free from oppression. Figures like Nelson Mandela, Steve Biko, Albert Luthuli, Desmond Tutu, and countless unsung heroes remind us that the struggle for justice is long, but it is always worth fighting. The lessons learned from South Africa resonate far beyond its borders, reminding us to remain vigilant against prejudice and discrimination in our own communities and societies. It encourages us to speak out against injustice, to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, and to always believe in the possibility of a better world. If this story has moved you, informed you, or inspired you, please consider taking a moment to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of human history and resilience. Your support helps us to continue sharing these vital lessons with a wider audience. Thank you for watching.